Harvard Divinity School.
Uses and abuses of power in alternative spiritualities. Implications for spiritual care of patients and communities. April 27th, 2023.
Okay, so I'm going to be looking a little bit at content moderation. I'm hoping this will actually be, since I'm the last one, a little bit interactive, and maybe a little bit less of me just reading. But yes, I've spent a lot of time looking at all sorts of things. And to give you a sense, this is something that I took from Meetup way back when, but this kind of like tells you a little bit about how we envision like trust and safety operations, but also like what's the core business of things like Facebook groups or things like Meetup groups, right? And trust is a really huge part of that. You'll find that for a lot of this, this also drives a lot of like the business motivations around it, membership. So we already are trying to figure out like what's actually considered safe and what do we think is acceptable. And especially because we are broadcasting a lot of this stuff to the rest of the world, the question is like, okay, so how do we evaluate what's worthy of actually going viral? And what is it that people should be allowed to join? And so that also kind of feeds into this kind of like enlarging network effect of like, what do we consider like the network and platform, and how do we just create better products and services overall? So some of the key questions that we're going to get into today are, how do social media companies even evaluate the legitimacy? And what are some of the moral inheritances that actually inform that? A lot of my questions upon arriving here at Harvard Divinity School is I didn't even know what secularism was, nor did I even consider it as having an application into my work, right? I presumed that most of my work was operating in the secular sphere, but does that mean that it carries no other types of religious moral inheritances? And I think we all know that's probably not true. And then how do we understand consent and informed consent when we're broached with these topics of faith, especially new faiths or emerging and evolving spiritualities, and especially when people report harm? And then through what lens are they reporting the harm, and in what ways do we actually even allow them to report the harm, and through what lenses? And then what happens when privately run secular companies get to operate globally and then impose some of these perhaps US-centric ideals of what is legitimate and what's not? And does social media actually give rise to some of those certain spiritualities over others? I'll get a little bit into like what is content moderation, and hopefully most people know, but I think that actually it has a few more layers to it than most people think. The algorithmic virality and governance and design and content moderation decisions that Meta has are reshaping power and politics and how we communicate around the world. Facebook's community standards articulate to the public what speech, content, media, and actions are welcome and are not allowed on Facebook. And these guidelines complement the terms of service and design of Facebook's technologies that boundary and govern the online social interactions globally. Community standards ostensibly operate as a moral document, framing the organizational ethics that influence how individuals engage and organize. And these documents outline the standards that anyone using Facebook or Meta's products as a whole is expected to adhere to, and they are subject to change at any time without public ratification or accountability. They are used as the basis to justify content moderation decisions. And this includes the removal, suppression, and censorship of content and the blocking of groups and individuals who are determined to violate these regularly updated and edited terms. So trust and safety and content moderation decisions extend beyond simply looking at content. So it's not just a yes or no decision. There are numerous levels of decisions that can be applied that determine whether a content is accessible, whether or not they are hidden behind an interstitial or some kind of click-through wall or a warning, or viewable only in certain countries or states or to certain age groups. They suppress its ability to go viral across different demographics or to a greater or lesser extent. So many of these actions are taken without notice or transparency. And so in many cases, and I will say that most of the time they try to make it transparent, but there are many cases when that's not deemed to be acceptable, and partly because we want to make sure that we're not enabling or informing people how to thwart the systems that actually determine their legitimacy, or especially when it comes to cases of harm. And so adjustments to the algorithm or human review determinations aren't really made transparent, and it's not something that anybody has to vote in. That's just something that a company can decide upon. And so in an effort to scale operations, many of these decisions are actually automated by machine learning. And so a lot of it is really based on consistency, not necessarily whether or not we're evaluating the whole context of the humans involved. So the reason why this is actually important is because it really influences our perspectives and shapes our behaviors, right? We already know that this is happening all the time. I think that there have been a lot of reports about this, but it does really shape how we rally around things. And Facebook and social media in general is really how most people will be able to evangelize, especially new faiths or practices. Mostly for a long time, there may have had this slogan that was like, find your people. I think that's very much exactly how online media platforms are working. It is about trying to find your groups, especially when you're trying to extend yourself beyond just yourself and perhaps your local environment. These decisions, even the choice of inaction or omission from consideration, have a really oversized impact on global affairs as well. And I think that that might not be really the crux of this, but I think it's important to consider that this isn't just a US-centric issue, that when we're looking at these, even though my examples might be a bit US-centric, we really have to consider, like, what does this mean in terms of the replication of colonialism or imperialist values when we evaluate the faiths or beliefs and practices of people in other countries, and how is it that oftentimes that replicates those kinds of positionalities. And also this influences and shapes our behaviors and what we communicate to one another. So immediately, if you're told that like this, you can't post this, then you just won't post it, right? And this has become kind of a learning pattern that most people adapt to. But it does impact essentially like how it is that we write and how it is that we communicate ourselves and how obvious or inobvious we are about or explicit we are with what it is that we're doing. And you kind of get that with a lot of what we call kind of fringe spiritualities or things that may not be explicitly legal. And so you'll find that people circumvent that by creating lots of acronyms or different ways of referring to their faith practices. And so you'll find that like a lot of people really do try to reshape what they're saying because they've been blocked one time and they're like, well, I need to redo this again. So that definitely changes also the future of AI. And I think that, as we know from the news, this will greatly shape how it is that we source information in the future. The moral inheritances of secularism. So it's my assertion that tech operates and governs in prescribed secular ways. And as a result, has emerged with situated moralities and ideals that can replicate social inequities and religious and spiritual hierarchies that privilege certain faiths and belief systems over others. Talal Asad, a cultural anthropologist who writes about religion and secularism and its integral role in shaping our conceptions of modernity, provides an examination into this genealogy of secularism and the ways it is entwined with Christianity and modern liberalism. So his work informs how to thoughtfully interrogate the ways that the secular carries inherited legacies of European Christian moral dominance. And Facebook's governance, as articulated through their community standards, I would assert are a modern representation of secular, liberal, and Christian moral ideals. Assad's analysis unveils how exclusion and inequality are created and masked through its translations into secular liberalism. Moral distinction between the religious and the secular cannot be presumed. There is a language and precise and practice of liberal believers who live in a secular society and have redefined their religiosity so that it is entirely compatible with, if not entirely equivalent to the secular. And according to Assad, religion is both a subject of translation and a way of knowing that is mutually influenced. Religious beliefs and society are in an entwined relationship with one another that builds alignment with one another. And now these beliefs are being shaped through what is deemed legitimate on social media. The moral commitments of secularism remain largely the same as those of Christianity. Equal liberty, moral equality, balanced by rational and moral responsibilities are central assumptions in both secularism and Christianity. And the presumption that tech operates as secular and therefore is devoid of religious bias is inaccurate. The religious realities of secularism carry religious hierarchies and Christian moral logics, and thus questions whether or not the frameworks by which we solve for religious and spiritual dimensions of conflicts that surface in social media should be really held by social media companies and applied without really evaluating what it is or how it is that they define feminism. So it elicits questions for me about how religious hierarchies show up in meta systems architecture implicitly, even if religious hierarchies are not really made explicit through the policies. And while I don't really have an answer to this problem, I do think we should push ourselves to ask these questions because they haven't really been voiced before. So kind of get into a little bit about some of these inheritances. These are actually from Meetup's policy page because honestly, navigating Facebook's standards or community standards is actually a little bit harder. But I think we can see here that like, it's totally okay if you do this, but only if you do it in private, right? And what do we do about groups where nudity might be an issue in that? And I think we can kind of see where maybe this traces back to certain puritanical values around like, what do we consider to be acceptable and publicly acceptable? Another thing to highlight is that most companies will also have policies around violence and harm. And when we look at things, there's a lot of room for interpretation here. So like, how do we actually evaluate acts of physical harm against other people? Some of that might seem really direct, but also there are ways that we're like, well, what do we mean by emotional harm? Or how is it that we see the things that aren't actually visible harm? And then same things with animal abuse. I will admit that there were cases of animal sacrifice or practices in Korea that emerged out of Brooklyn, New York. Because it had been called in to the police, it was something that we had to evaluate. Like, are they not allowed to actually practice? And how do we actually understand the police involvement in this and evaluating what is legitimate or not legitimate? And was it actually human sacrifice, or was it something that was interpreted as sacrifice? And do we consider that actual animal harm or not in terms of its interpretation? So there's a lot of questions that happen when you're kind of dealing with also a digital format where you don't really have all the contextual clues to really understand well, how is it this practice actually works and evolves? And we're also not experts on faith. So some key considerations, and then we'll get into some examples. The question is like, is it harmful? And so imagine yourself that you're evaluating something new for the first time and somebody's escalated it. You're like, how do I even determine that? And is it consensual? So I think we have to ask ourselves, again, a lot of these questions. And is it legal, and is it transparent and honest? Before I get into that, I'm just going to give you a few examples, which I found online. But I also think it's useful to figure out how it is that you would even post something on Facebook if you're going to try to create a pager group. I haven't been on Facebook in a long time, so actually I revived my account just for this. So when you create a Facebook page, you pick a page name, but also you have to pick categories. And so if I were to create a category and I want us to say I'm a spiritual group, you'll notice that like there's no option for me to actually pick spiritual or anything related to spirit. And if I was to say something about like faith, that doesn't show up either, right? So you're kind of limited by what it is that they actually allow you to categorize yourself as. However, if I said religious, it could be a religious organization, a religious center, any of these things, but you'll notice that for alternative spiritualities, there's not a lot of room for you to actually publicize or try to reach. Now I'm going to take a look at a few groups, and I'd love for you to actually help me evaluate some of these. We are the Prana Life Force Energy Group, and what we're about is that is it possible to be free from the most essential needs like food and water, consuming and elimination, how much money and time do you need to buying or cooking your own food? So this is a Breatharian group, and it's still public. And I guess the question is, should it be, especially if they're endorsing or reported for harms, saying that this is a form of self-harm in terms of starving oneself or contributing to eating disorders. Put that out there to the group. What are some of the considerations we'd like to have? Yeah.
It's in Kenya that they just discovered 40 dead corpses of a non-eating group group who believed in starvation.
Got it. So you mentioned a group in Kenya that like 40 people were found dead from not eating, from starving themselves.
By country, the number may be wrong.
Okay, the country number might be wrong.
The continent is right.
But the continent, right. Any concerns or questions about this? Yeah.
I don't know, like it's yes, on one hand, it's saying, is it possible to be free from food and water? It's not actually saying, it's possible, here's how you do it. It's just presenting a possibility instead of a prescription.
Yeah, so presenting a possibility, but not a prescription. And I guess in the case when actually breatharians first came to me, it was because it was reported by someone else as being harmful, right? And so how would you maybe question or try to like legitimize whether or not that report of harm is actually rightful? Yeah.
First of all, I would ask, is there good pressure? Is it an individual path, or are we going to put pressure on each other to not split paths?
Questions like, is there peer pressure, or is it like individual choice?
It's a very small group, something like that.
Yeah, and I think that what you'll find is that for a lot of these groups, oftentimes the default choice is like, we can allow it, but we won't actually publicize it, right? It won't be part of the viral algorithms. It won't actually be promoted. So if you're looking for it specifically, you can find it. But it's not that it's actually promoted in any way, shape, or form on like people's like potential groups to join. All right, I'm going to move on to this one. So One Taste Silicon Valley. I'm actually kind of surprised that these are still around, but because there was a lot of reports on them. But as seen in Nightline and New York Times, One Taste is a leader in the slow sex movement. We teach partnered sexuality practice called orgasmic meditation that bridges the gap between mindfulness and sexuality. The practices and philosophies are there. And so I'm going to actually also ask, I think, this one might also tell us a little bit more. Similar group on Facebook. We come together as practitioners to share our stories, support each other. This one is a little bit more explicit. Orgasmic meditation is a partnered practice in which one person will stroke another person's clitoris for 15 minutes with no goal. So the other thing that's also important to note is that these groups exist, and there have certainly been lawsuits filed against them. So how do we determine both the legitimacy and safety of this particular group? Yeah. Oh, no. Okay. Yeah. Any questions you would want to ask when evaluating this? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally people who are drawn into something through peer pressure or other kinds of coercive persuasion benefit most from more information. So it seems like a big question the content moderators would want to ask is, if we exclude these groups from public forums, do we push them into more secretive private forums where participants are less likely to encounter countervailing information?
Got it. So just going to repeat to those on Zoom, you're saying that if we don't, that there's kind of an information gap in this too. And so content moderators, perhaps in their evaluation, if they deny accessibility to this group, does it just push people into the shadows of the internet? And then therefore, does that, sorry, what was the last part of that?
Just denies people access to countervailing information.
Yeah, so denying access to countervailing information. Great. And then I will also show you this to kind of explain a little bit also that for psychedelic groups, for example, we get into questions of legality. And so you'll find that for a lot of these groups, it's okay to have a support group. It's okay to have a decriminalization group or a discussion group, but it's probably not okay to actually have a practice group where you're ingesting psychedelics, right? And so a lot of people, again, will skirt around this because of what the policies actually read as and because of what companies are willing to take on as risk. Couple more examples. And then I think okay, got it. I think we have also a lot of questions around money rituals and that, pagans, and also vampire groups. There's all sorts of groups that you can find on Facebook if you're really looking. But you'll find that it's actually hard to determine what is acceptable or not. So when we get into abuse and harm, I think it also takes a really different perspective. And some of the things that we should probably consider is whether or not secular and Christian morals or values certainly contribute to how it is that we evaluate what is safe and unsafe, and what can be public and not public. So some of the things that are also important to consider is that a lot of, especially new emerging faiths, are really concerned about their perception. And so I think the questions that oftentimes alternative spiritualities or those who are trying to start groups in that nature should ask themselves, and I think is a very conscious effort, is like, what information actually need collected? Could this actually be used against me in the future? Does this have legal implications? How might my information or the information of my members also be used and shared? Does this put anybody else in my community at risk? And who gets to go viral, and where might that be surfaced? Do I have control over that or not, in terms of who might be able to consume that? Because certainly if you are a group that is perhaps an alternative to another group, you might either end up in competing things, or you end up with a lot of kind of adversarial dynamics that will show up online. And then also, what kinds of warnings need to be provided? A lot of these spiritual groups will often say that you have to adhere by Facebook's community standards, not really articulating exactly what that is, but kind of as a coverall to say, like, we're not really responsible for what happens here. And so if you're somehow booted off the platform, or if you're reported for your activities on here, we're not actually responsible for it. And what controls do you promote or provide over that information is a big question. So I think some of the new questions that emerged for me, which again, I don't really have answers to, but I'd be curious about, is how we evaluate abuse and harm shaped by Christian morals as the secularism. Is the freedom of faith racialized, and is it afforded equally to all? Do US-centric values as imposed by social media become a modern form of colonialism and imperialism? And did it carry coded or racialized social and religious hierarchies? And can content moderation evaluation without interrogation potentially lead to its own versions of abuse of power? And does that minimize the abilities for alternative spiritualities in some cases to be grown and others to not be? Thanks so much for your time. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I feel like I'm just kind of percolating on these questions, but I don't actually have a lot of formal answers. And I think you'll find that, again, making these kind of decisions isn't really consistent. They always pose a lot of new questions.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, President and Fellows of Harvard College.